The marble floors of the National Research Institute gleamed beneath the morning sun, polished so carefully that they mirrored the skylights above like glass. The building itself towered at the heart of the city, a monument to human progress, housing some of the world's most brilliant scientific minds. Here, equations that could bend the laws of physics were scribbled on chalkboards. Discoveries that would one day power rockets to distant planets were whispered in crowded halls. Yet among the scholars and professors who strode purposefully through its corridors, there walked a man nobody noticed. His name was Samuel Carter. To most, he was invisible, the janitor with a mop and bucket, the quiet man with tired eyes who emptied trash cans and dusted chalkboards long after the professors had left. His uniform was faded but neatly pressed, his sneakers worn thin but always clean. He moved through the institute like a shadow, cleaning the very spaces where history was being written. Yet behind those quiet eyes and calloused hands was something none of the world's greatest scientists could have imagined. For Samuel was no ordinary man. He possessed a mind unlike any other, an intelligence so vast that the old scales of measurement could not contain it. Decades ago, during his troubled youth, experimental psychologists had tested him, their instruments shattered beneath the weight of his genius. They measured his IQ at nearly 900, a number so unthinkable it was dismissed as myth. And so Samuel had learned to bury it, to hide his gift behind silence. Because genius, he discovered, was not always a blessing. It could be a curse. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. That morning, the Institute's largest lecture hall hummed with excitement. On the great blackboard that spanned the room, a new problem had been written in bold white chalk, a theorem concerning quantum field stability, something so complex that it had confounded even the Institute's most celebrated professors for years. Rumors said that solving it could unlock energy sources beyond anything humanity had ever seen, perhaps even the key to faster-than-light travel. Graduate students clustered in groups, scribbling furiously, their brows furrowed with desperation. Professors leaned over, debating, pointing, arguing. The air itself vibrated with tension. Samuel was there, mop in hand, quietly polishing a section of the floor near the back of the hall. He kept his head low, his movements steady, but his eyes never left the board. To him, the theorem was not a riddle. It was a song, a pattern that spoke a language only he could fully understand. The solution unfolded in his mind instantly, like watching a movie he had already seen. But he did nothing. He just continued to mop, blending into the background, while the brightest minds in the world struggled and stumbled. It wasn't until hours later, when the hall was silent and empty, that Samuel allowed himself to approach the board. His hands shook as he picked up a piece of chalk, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of memory. He remembered the last time he had dared to reveal himself, the punishment, the ridicule, the fear of being treated like a machine instead of a man. Still, the need burned inside him. He could not leave the puzzle unsolved. His chalk touched the board. Line after line poured forth with breathtaking elegance. He did not pause, he did not hesitate. To him, it was as natural as breathing. Minutes later, the impossible theorem lay unraveled before him, solved in its entirety. Samuel stared at it one last time, his heart pounding, then quietly set the chalk down. He picked up his mop and walked away as though nothing had happened. The following morning, chaos erupted. Professor Adrian Hawthorne, a man revered in physics circles across the world, stormed into the lecture hall after hearing frantic whispers from his students. When he saw the board, his knees nearly buckled. The solution was perfect, elegant, complete. He ran his fingers across the chalk lines, whispering in disbelief. This is correct. His colleagues gathered, gasping. "Who did this?" one demanded. "Which student? Which professor?" But no one knew, and that was the beginning of the Institute's greatest mystery. Meanwhile, Samuel moved through the day exactly as before. He polished brass railings, emptied bins overflowing with crumpled paper, and dusted bookshelves lined with scientific journals. But inside, a storm brewed. He knew the question was coming. Someone would notice. Someone always noticed. That evening, as he finished wiping down a chalkboard in one of the smaller classrooms, he sensed someone behind him. He turned to find Professor Hawthorne himself, eyes narrowed, watching him. "What are you doing?" the professor asked. Samuel froze. The chalk was still in his hand. A half-written correction gleamed on the board. "Just cleaning, sir," he murmured. But Hawthorne stepped closer, examining the symbols Samuel had left behind. They weren't random marks. They were precise, sharp, brilliant. His eyes widened. "Did you write this?" Samuel's throat went dry. His instinct screamed at him to run. "Just cleaning," he repeated, lowering his gaze. He set the chalk down and picked up his bucket. Without another word, he slipped past the professor and out the door, leaving behind a silence heavy with revelation. From that moment, the chase began. Professors whispered in corridors. Students speculated wildly. Some thought a visiting genius had appeared in the night. Others swore it was a hoax. But Hawthorne knew better. He had seen the truth in Samuel's trembling hands. He knew the janitor was not what he seemed. And in the quiet of his one-room apartment that night, Samuel sat alone, staring at the pile of discarded research papers he had collected from the Institute's trash. He spread them across his tiny kitchen table, each one a puzzle, each one a doorway into a world that others only dreamed of. But he did not smile. He did not feel proud. Instead, his eyes drifted to an old photograph taped to the wall, a faded image of a woman holding a little boy, his mother, himself. The memories came back, sharp and painful. The orphanage, the endless tests, the way grown men had looked at him as though he were less human and more machine, and the loneliness, always the loneliness. His genius had given him everything and taken everything away. And now, it was about to surface again. But the more Samuel tried to retreat into silence, the more the world pushed him forward. News of the solved equation had slipped past the lab walls. A whisper among scientists became a headline in a local paper. Then a ripple across international forums where mathematicians debated who among them could have cracked such a code. Names of Nobel laureates in renowned institutions were tossed around, but none of them fit the timeline. And so a mystery bloomed, one the scientific community could not ignore. Inside the institution, the scientists were torn between awe and suspicion. Could it have been an accident? A lucky guess? Or perhaps some hidden collaboration? They began watching Samuel more closely, testing him in ways that were subtle at first, leaving chalk scribbles half-finished on the board, pages of equations casually forgotten near his mop bucket. Samuel noticed, of course. He always noticed. His mind worked like the gears of a well-oiled clock, spinning faster than anyone could imagine. Yet he pretended to ignore the traps. It was safer that way. He had lived long enough to understand that genius, in the wrong hands, was a weapon, and Samuel had no desire to be weaponized. But memory is a cruel thing. Every night, when he closed his eyes, he returned to the moment his gift had first betrayed him. He was only a child then, sitting at a rickety kitchen table in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city. His mother, exhausted from working 2 jobs, had given him a stack of schoolwork to keep him busy. Within minutes, Samuel had corrected not just his homework, but the teacher's printed errors in the textbook itself. His mother's pride had been radiant, but pride quickly turned to fear when school officials began asking questions. Why could a boy of 8 solve equations no college student had mastered? It didn't take long before men in suits appeared at their door. They called themselves researchers, educators, benefactors. They promised opportunity, scholarships, a future. But Samuel had seen the way they looked at him. Not as a boy, but as a specimen. His mother had slammed the door on them, and for that, Samuel was forever grateful. But protection had its price. Isolation followed. The family moved often. Running from shadows Samuel never quite understood, but always felt. That was the first fracture in his life. The second came years later, when his father, a quiet, hard-working man, died suddenly. Samuel had been 16. The funeral was modest. The grief enormous. He had stood at the grave, numb, calculating the trajectory of the raindrops against the coffin lid, wondering why his brain could reduce tragedy to numbers, but couldn't tell him how to soothe his mother's broken heart. That was when he began to resent his own mind, to wish he could turn it off, like a radio playing too loud in an empty room. Back in the present, Samuel tried to keep those memories buried, but the institution's obsession with his abilities made it impossible to disappear into the shadows. One night, when the corridors were empty and the hum of fluorescent lights echoed like a dirge, a group of scientists confronted him. "Samuel," one of them said, a tall man with glasses perched precariously on his nose, "we know it was you. The problem you solved, no one else here could have done it. Not in this way." Samuel kept sweeping, his face expressionless. "Why hide it?" another pressed. "You could change the world, don't you understand? What you did, it's decades ahead of where we are now." He finally paused, leaning on the broom handle, his eyes meeting theirs with a calm intensity that unsettled them. "And what would you do with it? Change the world or control it?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Over the next weeks, the tension only grew. Samuel was given a choice, though it wasn't presented as one: reveal the full extent of his abilities or be replaced. They framed it kindly with promises of recognition, wealth, a chance to step out of the shadows. But beneath the smiles lurked greed. He had seen it before. He would not fall for it again. Still, even Samuel could not resist forever. There was one problem, one equation so complex it had haunted even him for years. A theoretical puzzle about quantum entanglement and dimensional folding, one that the brightest physicists had labeled impossible. Samuel had solved it once, in secret, on a crumpled piece of paper that he later burned. But now the weight of the institution's pressure made him consider what would happen if he revealed it. As fate would have it, the decision was taken from him. One stormy night, when thunder rattled the glass panes and rain hammered the roof like an army of fists, the lead scientists convened an emergency session. They presented Samuel with the impossible equation on a whiteboard, their eyes gleaming with challenge. "This," they said, "is beyond any of us. If you can solve it, if you truly are what we suspect, then prove it." Samuel felt the room shrink around him. The rain outside sounded like his racing heart. For a long moment he stood still, mop in hand, as though weighing the gravity of the choice. Then slowly he set the mop aside, picked up a marker, and began to write. Every stroke of the marker was deliberate, precise, as if he were carving truth into the very bones of the universe. The scientists watched in stunned silence. Their breaths caught, their eyes wide as Samuel's solution unfolded across the board, like a symphony of numbers and symbols. It took less than 10 minutes. When he finished, he set the marker down, wiped his hands on his faded janitor's uniform, and stepped back. The room was silent except for the storm. One scientist whispered, "My God!" Another stumbled into a chair, as if the weight of what they had just witnessed was too much to bear. And then the revelation came, not just among those in the room, but across the entire scientific world, once the solution was verified. Samuel, the quiet janitor, the man they all ignored, had just solved the problem that had stumped humanity for generations. His IQ was tested, retested, confirmed. A number appeared on the report so staggering it seemed like fiction. 900. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar heard across the globe. The boardroom where Samuel had once been humiliated now stood in silence. The same men who laughed at his overalls, who sneered at his mop and bucket, now sat frozen, their pens idle, their papers useless. For in front of them, Samuel had done what none of their degrees, none of their research grants, none of their accolades could achieve. He had solved it. The equation, the sequence, the impossible puzzle of energy conversion that had defied every top laboratory on Earth. The revelation was undeniable. Screens glowed with numbers, graphs shifted, algorithms corrected themselves in real time as his solution took hold. Scientists whispered, some with awe, others with a deep, gnawing envy. And Samuel, still in his janitor's uniform, sleeves rolled up and calloused hands steady, simply stepped back from the board and let the silence speak for him. For years he had been invisible, a shadow sweeping across corridors, a man the world dismissed with a single glance. Yet here, in this moment, He stood taller than Nobel laureates, brighter than the legacy of institutions that had forgotten what true discovery looked like. But Samuel's victory wasn't in their recognition. His true triumph was in reclaiming himself. The boy who once solved puzzles under candlelight, the man who carried the grief of a lost child, the widower who worked nights so no one could see his tears. And still, as applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rising like a wave, Samuel's eyes were distant. His mind was not on the praise, nor on the promises of fame and fortune already spilling from eager lips. Instead, his thoughts wandered back to a quiet grave where a small headstone bore the name of his daughter, to the long nights he spent whispering to her photograph, vowing that he would make her proud, to the woman he had once loved, who believed he was more than the world ever allowed him to be. The scientists rushed toward him, each one eager to shake his hand, to attach themselves to his genius like moths drawn to flame. Journalists poured into the room, their cameras flashing, their voices tumbling over one another with questions. How did you do it? Who taught you? What will you do next? But Samuel raised his hand, not in arrogance, but in quiet command. The room hushed. His voice, deep and calm, carried across the space with the weight of truth. I am no miracle, he said. I am no God. I am just a man who saw what others overlooked, because I had to, because I knew what it meant to be overlooked myself. Intelligence means nothing if it serves only pride. Knowledge means nothing if it ignores compassion. If I leave you with anything, let it be this. Sometimes the greatest minds are the ones you never think to ask. The words struck deeper than the equations still glowing on the screens. They lingered in the air, heavier than any accolade, sharper than any rebuttal. For once, the world's brightest minds were not thinking of theories or rivalries. They were thinking of the janitor, the man who carried both brilliance and grief in equal measure. Weeks passed. Samuel's name became a storm across headlines, a marvel, a mystery. Governments called, corporations offered millions, universities begged for lectures. Yet Samuel moved carefully, thoughtfully. He declined interviews that sought only spectacle. He rejected deals that demanded ownership of his mind. Instead, he returned, not to the broom, but to the people. He quietly funded scholarships for children from forgotten neighborhoods. He spoke in community halls rather than stadiums. He chose humility over grandeur. And in those quiet choices, he built something far greater than fame. He built a legacy rooted not in what he discovered, but in who he chose to lift with him. The janitor with a 900 IQ was no longer a secret, but more importantly, he was no longer alone. One evening, as autumn leaves fell across the university grounds, Samuel walked past the same corridors he had once swept. Students hurried by with books in hand, and some stopped to smile at him, not out of pity, but out of respect. In a lecture hall nearby, a professor quoted his words about compassion over pride. In the library, his papers sat bound with gold seals. But Samuel only paused by a window, staring out into the fading light. The world finally knew his name. But for Samuel, the truest victory was quiet. The knowledge that he had proven to himself, and to the daughter he still carried in his heart, that being unseen did not mean being unworthy. His reflection in the glass showed a man older, weathered, but free. A man who had turned pain into purpose, silence into symphony. The janitor had become the teacher. The overlooked had become unforgettable. And as the stars began to pierce the evening sky, Samuel whispered softly, a promise carried into the night. This is only the beginning. Before we leave you today, if this story moved you, we'd be honored if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder of their worth. Every person, no matter how overlooked, carries a story that could change the world. Until next time, remember, greatness often hides in the humblest of places,